All right, guys, hope you're doing well. Saturday here in San Francisco. I hope you're energized. I hope you're inspired by Cecilia Davis Hayes. She is simply exceptional. One of the most incredible people I've ever met. I got to say, I could have spent all day talking to her. She has so much to provide, so many lessons. So let's do a couple of things here. I'm going to introduce Andy Blow for this next section on precision hydration, but we've got a little bit of housekeeping, a little bit of information, a little bit of news, and some guidance for you. It is going to be a cracking day ahead. But first, something that's exciting. We're over the wall. We've started. We are officially over $45,000 now for our fundraising, and that is opening up the absolute power of sport to so many kids. We are doing something special. I got to spend last night chatting to and having dinner with Bob Babbitt, the founder of the Challenged Athletes Foundation, and the stories had Kelly and I literally in tears. They are just unbelievably inspiring, and it's a mission of this. And so throughout the course of this day, firstly, of course, towards the end of the day, we've got a whole section with Mohamed Lama. It is do not miss. But throughout the day, if we can come together, we are literally changing people's lives. And it's not just about sport, it's about confidence, it's about how they stand up in society. And so I ask all of us here, that anything, whether it's $5, $10, whatever we can do, we'll put the chat in the link in the chat box. But anything that you could provide to help, I think collectively, we want to crack $50,000 over the course of this weekend. And if we can do that, we can give each other the biggest virtual hugs possible. So what a start yesterday. Goodness me, I hope that you heard my humble overview, but Sami Inkinen, despite, of course, the couple of drops that we had, it's always fun when you're staring at the camera and wondering where your guest is, but Sami provided so much. One of the things that I just found so staggering was 800 people a day dying every day in the US through diabetes. Goodness me, it's an incredible inspirational story. And if you missed that last night, I tell you, that is do not miss session. You've got to go back and watch that. But don't go and do that now, because we have got a jam-packed day ahead. It's very, very special. And I will say that we've got a trickling of more people joining us. But if you enjoyed yesterday's session and you thought, wow, this is really going to be something, now that you're here, if you know anyone else that you think would benefit from this amazing session, remember that even though they missed yesterday, they can still go back and watch all of those recordings. So give the gift. Go and tell your friends, tell your family, anyone that would benefit. We've still got a whole 2 days of action and education and, of course, inspiration behind. So really encourage you to share with your friends and family or anyone that you think might benefit from this. I'd also love you, all of us, to get connected outside of this platform a little bit. And what I mean by that is we're going to use a hashtag. Now, I'm not the biggest social media fan, but it's a wonderful vehicle for us to actually share what we're doing. Many of you folks got out for a walk or a run this morning, and I asked you to put the hashtag throughout the weekend. We are going to use hashtag Performance Reset 2020. So if you're inspired, if you get some lessons, if you go out and do some of the activations, anything that's funny, just share it out there. We'll connect it. We'll share your posts, and we'll really start to make a little movement so that we can help people and make it really good fun. If you did take a photo when you're out running, get it up there and get it going. So check the schedule. Over the course of this day, it is going to be busy. It's very, very busy. There is a lot going on. And so I really encourage you to check the schedule. Use every opportunity, remember, to hop into the expo. All of our partners are there. Keep an eye on the chat section across the reception, the main stage, any of the breakout sessions, and of course in each of the individual expos, because the team of experts and everyone at Purple Patch is there to help you. Any technical issues, any challenges that you have. But what we've got now over the next few minutes is something that's important. I'm really proud to introduce Andy Blow, who's joining us. He's probably having his afternoon tea right now because he's joining us from the UK. And if you don't know Andy, Andy is the founder and CEO of Precision Hydration. And he is, simply put, one of the preeminent hydration experts in the world. He has worked with everybody at high class performance. Formula One, auto racing, Premiership Soccer, Major League Baseball, CEOs and executives, some of the top endurance athletes in the world. He knows everything about performance and hydration. And so this is a conversation and a session around performance hydration. And Andy is going to go through, and then as soon as we finish his session, he's going to hop up, he's going to jump out, and he's going to run into a Q&A session. So prepare your questions. If you're a VIP ticket holder, you can go into that more intimate setting. You'll be able to ask Andy any question that you want around hydration. And on top of it, I really encourage you to dive into the Precision Hydration Expo, because in there, the whole Precision Hydration team are going to be there waiting. And you can sign up and register for a one-to-one session, completely complimentary, where they'll spend 15 or 20 minutes with you troubleshooting over your own hydration challenges. And throughout the weekend, they're incredibly fun, incredibly well-informed team, and they are here to help you throughout any of your hydration woes, whether it's daily life and energy, or whether it's why am I cramping when I'm going to do these incredibly hot races. And so I give you that. Andy Blow, Precision Hydration. I'm going to throw this over to the UK. Andy, get cracking.
The idea of whether we should drink to thirst or drink to a predetermined plan when we're racing is something that we have conversations with athletes about all the time. And quite often what strikes me is that we perceive it to be this kind of binary choice. Like there's drinking to thirst or there's drinking to a plan, and no sort of middle ground, no grey area in the middle. But what I want to talk about today, the main bit of what I want to talk about, what some might call the meat and potatoes of this subject, is actually that grey area, that middle ground of how we blend the two and how we come up with a kind of flexible plan where we can also use our instincts. But before we do that, I think to set the scene, what would be a really good idea is to take a look back into history at the type of advice we've been giving athletes for over 100 years now, to see where that sort of binary thinking has come from. Around 100 years ago, there was this great quote from James Sullivan, who was the head of the Amateur Athletic Union in the US at the time. And he said, "Don't get into the habit of eating or drinking in a marathon race. Some prominent runners do, but it's not beneficial." And this really sums up the school of thought at the time, which was that nil by mouth was the way to go for endurance athletes. It was just a case of being really tough and not giving in to thirst or hunger and just getting through whatever you were doing. If we move on into the 1960s, the message was actually remarkably similar. Tommy Simpson, who was a world champion cyclist, a Tour de France rider, was advised by his Belgian trainer to avoid drinking when racing, especially in hot weather, to drink as little as possible and with the liquid not too cold. He was told it was only a question of willpower. And I think that, again, that sort of emphasis on abstinence and trying your hardest to ignore your body's instincts was quite pervasive at that time. If we move on to 1996, however, by then there was this complete 180-degree U-turn on the advice. The American College of Sports Medicine guidelines from '96 included the phrase that athletes should drink as much as was tolerable. The overarching message was drink as much as you sweat out to replace 100% of those losses, so that you were not suffering any dehydration, because dehydration was going to negatively impact your performance. Now, by 2007, that message had been moderated ever so slightly to include the phrase drink to prevent excessive dehydration. So there was no longer this remit to replace 100% of sweat losses, but there was this undertone that dehydration was bad and that we should limit dehydration at all costs if we could. And then come 2012, we got yet a different take on all of this. What happened in 2012 was that Professor Tim Noakes, a famous South African sports medic and sport and exercise science researcher, published this book called Waterlogged. And Waterlogged was all about highlighting the rise in cases of a condition called hypernatremia that he and other people had been observing over the last couple of decades, since really the advent of those mid-90s guidelines to drink as much as you could during endurance exercise and to avoid dehydration. And hyponatremia is a condition where your blood sodium levels are diluted down to dangerous levels. Although it can be influenced by sweating out salts and electrolytes, it's predominantly caused by overconsumption of water and dilute sports drinks during exercise. So the message was that people were being told to drink far, far too much, and that they were ignoring their body's thirst signals, overriding them, diluting their body, and causing this problem called hyponatremia. Now, the hyponatremia is incredibly dangerous if it's taken to extremes. There have been a number of deaths attributed to it in marathons, Ironmans, ultra endurance competitions, and that sort of thing. So Noakes's instinct was very it was very well founded in the idea of highlighting these deaths and then reducing the root cause of it. And he is not shy in this book at pointing the finger just totally at the sports drink industry, particularly at Gatorade. So he accuses them of all sorts of crimes against the profession by publishing research data that supported one thing only, which was that massive consumption of hydration products, notably theirs, would increase performance, and that dehydration was a real performance killer. And so I think where he started out from was this place of trying to communicate the fact that overdrinking was a real problem that had been sponsored and endorsed by the industry to a certain extent, and it was something that needed to be stamped out. So his antidote to that was to say, and he presents a very compelling argument for this, is to say what you should just do when you're exercising is to drink to the dictates of thirst. Drink when you're thirsty, and the body's natural mechanisms, which are exquisitely evolved over thousands of years to keep hydration levels, to keep sodium levels optimized, will kick in and will be absolutely fine. He cites loads of studies, loads of examples to back this up. And the thrust of it around preventing hyponatremia is that as you sweat proportionally more water than salt. So as you dehydrate, if you drink a little bit, your body will respond to that by only making you thirsty to a certain point, and then you won't be able to dilute your bloodstream down any further. And to a large extent, he's totally correct on that, because if we only drink when we're thirsty, the chances of becoming hyponatremic are very slim indeed. The problem with the argument, though, in my view, and in the view of a lot of other people in sports science, is that you can't stretch that to maximising performance. But in Waterlogged, he's very clear about this. He thinks this is the only way to hydrate, it's the best way to maximise performance. So in other words, drink water to thirst is the only hydration message that we need to send out to athletes. And I think that's where the problem is, because there becomes a point when if you only drink water to thirst, your blood volume contracts to the degree that you're not going to be able to sustain performance. But at this point, what I'll do is I'll spare you any more of my words on that subject and bring in the words of a couple of heavy-hitting top Ironman athletes to do a bit of talking for me.
I read Waterlogged and tried drinking to thirst. In Norseman 2015, where we had 10 degrees C water and as low as 0 degrees C on the bike, I had the race of my life. Then I tried the same in hot races like Ironman Hawaii, Challenge Phuket. The tactic in those conditions has given me varied results. A trip to the medical tent with an IV, cramps from toes to hands, and a serious craving to just jump in the river during the run of a race.
Drinking to thirst is likely to be a good approach in day-to-day life or in events completed at a very low intensity. However, in my opinion, it's a terrible approach for those looking to maximise their performance. During racing, my thirst response is subdued. I can easily be 2 to 3 kilos down before I'm suddenly desperately thirsty and start gulping fluid at a rate that is completely incompatible with my gastric emptying. Perhaps there are athletes whose thirst response is a more reliable guide, but in my experience with both coaching and racing, drinking to a schedule, particularly in the first half of events, leads to vastly better performance outcomes.
So what these two quotes from really elite athletes demonstrate is not that drinking to thirst never ever works, but it does demonstrate that it's not applicable 100% of the time. I don't want to give the impression that these guys are like robots. I've worked with both of them and I've seen what their plans look like. These plans are not set in stone. They're sort of guardrails that they work within. They've got, especially early on in events, they've got targets of fluid and electrolyte consumption to hit that they know are going to keep their head above water and make sure that they're able to perform later in the event. So let's move on now back to the meat and potatoes of what do these sensible fluid and sodium guardrails actually look like. Well, the first thing to note about any recommendations for fluid and electrolyte intake is that they are highly individual. There's so many variables that interplay on this that there's no such thing, as we like to say at PH, as a one-size-fits-all approach. For example, sweat rate. That can vary massively from person to person, from as little as less than half a litre per hour up to 3 litres an hour in someone who's just got a massive sweat rate. Sodium loss in sweat. We see over a 10-fold difference from person to person when we measure sodium loss in sodium concentration in sweat. Body size. Of course, that has a massive implication because what's a small amount of sweat for a large person to lose is very different in total volume to what it is for a small person. Fitness level, that plays a part. Often it's not the thing that people think, because fitter people tend to sweat more than less fit people because it's a more efficient way of cooling the body. And of course, the environment. Hot heat and humidity, we're going to sweat way, way more than we are in freezing cold conditions, as Alan Hovder's quote showed us just before. The best way, I think, to think of this when it comes to, do I need to then build in a hydration plan, or can I get away with drinking to thirst, is to think of it not as two binary options, it's to think of this continuum line. So at one end of the line, we've obviously got drinking to thirst, at the other, we've got drinking to a plan. Things that are going to influence it, sweat rate. If you've got a very high sweat rate, it makes it more likely, especially in longer and hotter events, that it's going to push you towards the end of needing some sort of plan to meet your higher needs. If you're someone with a really low sweat rate, maybe your reliance on a plan can be equally small. The length of a race. Obviously, if we're just out there for an hour or two, we're not going to need as much of a plan as if we're going to be out there doing an Ironman or an ultra for 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 plus hours. Weather conditions. If we're racing in Florida in the summer, it's going to be very, very different to racing in the UK in the autumn. So we need to factor that in, because maybe we can get away with having less of a stringent plan when the weather conditions are that much cooler, because our total sweat losses are going to be a little bit less. Other things, a bit more subjective, that come into it, history of cramping. You know, if you're someone who's often suffered with cramps, especially in the heat, then maybe taking a look at the hydration plan and working it out in advance is going to be beneficial more than it is for someone who's not got that history. Experience level is massive for this, because if you're a beginner athlete, you've got a lot of things to think about when you're taking part in a new event, and it's very easy to leave hydration, to forget it, to not attend to your thirst instincts anywhere near as well as someone who's more experienced, and end up far deeper in the hole halfway through than you need to be. So experience level matters. And also another massive one is looking at your history of performance in the heat. If you're someone who's typically underperformed when it gets hot and humid, it's not always the case, but quite often that's a telltale sign that something isn't going quite right with your hydration. So maybe a more pre-planned approach is going to help. So if we're going to really start to build this out and look at getting some numbers to build a plan, what's the best place to start? And I think knowing two key factors is a really, really useful place to begin. They are estimating your sweat rate and knowing your sweat sodium concentration. So, estimating your sweat rate. I actually listened to a podcast recently by a really top sports scientist that I've got a lot of time and respect for, who talked about how athletes, can measure their sweat rates, weighing themselves before and after training sessions, and how he was adamant it was a total waste of time. And the inference was that, working out your sweat rate is not necessary if you're going to drink to thirst, it's not about body weight change that matters. That's not the big parameter that we're trying to control for here. And as if that was the aim of measuring your sweat rate, was to learn exactly how much fluid to replace so that your body weight didn't change. And I think that's one of the big misconceptions with this, is that estimating your sweat rate is useful because it helps you to just understand roughly the magnitude of how much sweat you lose in different conditions. It's not about nailing an exact number that we're going to try and replace. And the way to do it is to weigh yourself before a session, to work out, to weigh yourself after a session, to calculate the difference, and for every kilogram that you lose in body weight, corrected for how much you've had to drink during the session, you would have lost about 1 litre or 32 ounces of sweat. And the reason we do that is so that you can get a really good handle on, okay, in different conditions, is your sweat rate going to be on the low side? Is it going to be moderate? Is it going to be high? Or is it going to be really high? Because that will impact how stringently we want to attack replacement of it. But it's not about, 1 in, 1 out, learning exact numbers. And to calibrate your thinking on the amounts here, low sweat rates, I would say, generally for endurance athletes that are working hard at race pace in normal or warm conditions, if you're below about 750 millilitres or 24 ounces per hour, that's on the lower side of what we'd expect to see. Moderate, we usually see average quoted as about 1 litre or 32 ounces an hour. I'd say in endurance athletes who are fit and training hard, up to 48 ounces an hour, 1.5 litres an hour is fairly moderate. And then once we get above 1.5 litres or above that 48 ounces per hour, we're in the territory of actually having pretty high sweat losses. And at the really high end, I've seen athletes losing over 2.5, maybe even 3 litres per hour, which can actually become really quite problematic in really long and hot events, because replacing an adequate percentage of that can be really tough and requires a much more strategic approach. The other factor is estimating or measuring sweat sodium loss. So sodium loss in sweat is very much individual and largely genetic and sort of stable within an individual. This was a factor that I learned about as an athlete because my losses are on the high end, and that was what was causing me a lot of problems. Now, the reason this is relevant is that when we lose a lot of sodium in sweat during exercise, it has a profound effect on blood volume. The more sodium we lose, the more blood volume contracts over time, and the higher it is to keep blood volume up. And that's a crucial factor for maintaining endurance performance. And again, just to calibrate your thinking on what the numbers mean, if you can have your sweat sodium tested and get it accurately measured, if it comes out anything below about 800 milligrams per litre, then that is on the lower side. We sometimes see it as low and as dilute as 200 or 300 milligrams per litre, which is very, very dilute sweat. Once you get into the 800 to 1100 milligrams per litre, that's kind of the normal average range. That's the middle of the bell curve. And average in our database of thousands of tests is about 950, 980 milligrams per litre. So that's quite normal. If we get up to that 1100 to 1500 band, that's relatively high. And then there are a number of us out there who are above 1500 milligrams. My own level of sweat sodium loss is about 1800 milligrams per litre. We've occasionally measured athletes over 2000 milligrams per litre. So that range is pretty big. But the interesting thing about that number is it is pretty fixed, relatively speaking, for you as an individual. So one test is usually enough to get you in the right zone. If you can't get your sweat actually tested to analyse the sodium composition, then there are ways of estimating it. And on our website, precisionhydration.com, there is a blog all about estimating your sweat sodium loss, and it gives you some ideas of the clues to look for. Also, our online sweat test does kind of point you in the direction by asking the right questions to see what kind of level of sodium loss you are likely to be experiencing. Now, once we get these kind of figures together, we've got an estimate of our sweat sodium loss. We know roughly how much fluid we might be losing in certain conditions. The next step is the most important one. So this is where we've really got to start to pay attention and tune in, because once we've got that information, we've got to take it into a plan, but then we've got to test and evolve that plan with trial and error. And the trial and error part is so important, and it's often the part that doesn't get done really properly. To highlight it, there's a great quote from a guy called Tim Harford, who's an economist and who's an author, who's done a lot of studying of complex systems. And his quote is, "Show me a successful system and I'll show you one that's evolved through trial and error." So that's what we're going to look at now. In order to start this process of trial and error, we've got to think about the kind of numbers that are important here. And the numbers that we're looking at are how much fluid to take in per hour and how much sodium to take in per hour. They're the two main parameters that are going to drive the framework of your hydration plan or your hydration guardrails that we've been talking about. So if you've got very high sweat losses, if you think you've got a very high sweat rate based on data that you've collected or subjective feelings, and if you think you've got very high sodium losses and a poor history of performance in the heat, you could be looking at something in the region of up to 1 litre, 32 ounces of fluid per hour, and up to 1,500 milligrams of sodium per hour as well. In some cases, in some really extreme cases, it might even be a little bit more than that. But that's the kind of ballpark that we've seen work for athletes in the heat who have very, very high levels of loss. So if you think you're in that category, that's not a bad place to start playing around with some trial and error to see if it works for you. If you think that things are a bit more moderate, you think you've just got a normal sweat rate, normal kind of sodium losses, then it might be that you can be down at 500 to 750 millilitres of fluid per hour, 750 milligrams, 1,000 milligrams of sodium per hour. That's the kind of ballpark, again, to start playing in if you think your losses are more moderate, but you're still doing a long and hot event. If your losses are significantly lower than that, if you think you're someone who's not a big sweater, if you've not got a history of having any problems in the heat, if you've not got any of the signs that demonstrate that you might be losing a lot of sodium, your numbers could be well south of that. And you may just be able to operate on instinct for those. But getting your head around these kind of rough figures and then playing around with them with this trial and error process is critically important in order to actually refining it. Because without that real world trial and error, this is not something that you can work out just on a spreadsheet or with a pen and paper. Having said that, a piece of paper or a little spreadsheet might be useful as part of the process, because what you can do here is test out this strategy. You've got to commit to a strategy and you've got to test it out in some big training sessions or some smaller races. And where possible, you want to simulate racing conditions in those sessions or those little races so that you can actually start to see the effects of this plan with all the variables involved that are going to be involved on the big race day. Before each session, write the plan down, and then immediately afterwards, write down what you did, how much fluid you took, how much sodium you took, and then look at that in context of how you felt and how you performed. And that's something which is best done immediately after the session. With the elite athletes that we work with, we'll talk to them in the days leading up to the event to make sure their plan is set in their mind. And then on the day after, we'll be hassling them to return to us what they actually did so that we can compare it to performance. Because it's amazing how your mind forgets those things after a few days. So make those notes. And then what we do then is just a case of intelligently tweaking those numbers based on the experiences. Did you feel overly bloated and like you were blowing up and water was sloshing around? You probably drank too much fluid. Did you start hating the taste of salt or electrolytes later on in the event? You might have been taking too many of them. So we try and adjust the figures based on those things. But this process, this iterative process of test, make notes, adjust and go again is very, very simple. But it's not something that athletes do all the time. And I think the reason for that is that it's repetitive and it's not fun, but we need to engage with it. It's the kind of thing which, if you're prepared to do it, it's one of the basics that if you can do this time and time and time again, you can actually iterate your way to some guardrails, some fluid and sodium guardrails that will work for you for differing lengths of races and differing environmental conditions. You're building up an incredible mental database of what worked for you in these different places, and then when you're hit with different experiences in the future, you're fully able to adapt and roll with them and get the best out of yourself. If you don't take anything else away from this talk, I hope what I've managed to emphasise is that when it comes to hydrating for top performance, there are no real black and white answers, especially when it comes to whether you should drink to a plan or drink to thirst. The best athletes take a little bit of both of those approaches and they bring them together so that they have a flexible plan that on any given day can be adjusted with their instincts so they can really get the best out of their performance. If any of this has sort of piqued your interest or stimulated some questions, we're going to go live into a breakout session immediately following this, and myself and the rest of the PH crew will be headed to the Precision Hydration Expo booth to do one-to-one chats, but one-to-one video calls and answer any more in-depth questions you've got. So, team, let's head to the booth.